I'm Heather Sherman, and I work in the Public Affairs Department for Crumble. I'm working with Twain, who is joining us today, and Sarah Yuan is our summer intern. And we're here today to just give you a few bite-sized tips and a little bit of advice on how to help you best promote your work and your research, because that is our job, and we want to help you as best we can. So to start, we just introduced ourselves, but I'll do it again. So my name's Heather Sherman, and we've got Twain Pereira joining us, as well as Sarah Yuan, who is our intern for the summer. And we work together to essentially find story ideas and promote those story ideas, whether through written stories, through pitching media, or even through social media and creating content and videos and posts and things like that. So today we're going to present to you a quick step-by-step guide of what to do if you've got a new paper out and you're not sure how to get the word out about it or whether you should get the word out about it. This is a quick step-by-step guide that we're all going to pitch in on, and starting with the most important thing, which you would think is common sense but isn't always, and that is letting us know that you've got a new paper out. And the most important thing to do is to let us know in advance, because once you let us know once the paper's already out, we can certainly try to help promote it on social media. But if it's a paper that we're thinking might be something we might be able to pitch to media, telling us after the fact is not going to help. So we're not going to be able to do that. The best time to let us know is when the paper's been accepted to the journal. So then at that point, we at least usually have a couple of weeks to a couple of months to help prepare and to do all of the other steps that we're going to talk about to best figure out, how we can help you promote your work. So number 2 in our step-by-step guide, let's assume that you've already gone ahead and let us know that you've got a paper coming out. The most important thing for public affairs is to write a plain language summary. What does that mean? It's a plain language, something that can be understood by anyone who doesn't have a scientific background. And I've got a couple of points here on the left that really your plain language summary should just answer these 3 questions. What did you find? Why is it important? And how could it impact patient care? A lot of times in research, the stretch to talk about impacting patient care can be a lot. It may be something that doesn't immediately impact patient care, but it could in the future. So it's just giving us on the public affairs team just a little bit of context about the paper, because as you can imagine, and as you know from reading all of these very scientific papers, they're not always easily understandable. And so just sending us a link to the paper or sending us the paper itself without any explanation or any context isn't always super helpful. So on the right here, you have a plain language summary that I requested from Aki Nakamura, who works in the Schroeder Arthritis Institute, and with his permission, I'm putting it up for you here so you can have a quick look at it. But essentially, he had an amazing paper about a new therapeutic target for spondyloarthritis. And it's a very debilitating illness, and there was an immediate impact to patient care. So that, that was something that was really helpful for us. And Aki took the time and put this together for us. And again, it was very helpful because not only is it helpful for us to understand more about what the paper's about, but there were parts of this plain language summary that I was able to sort of use in a UHN news story and in a media pitch that we eventually sent out. So there's lots of uses for a plain language summary. It does take a bit of time, but it's an investment and it's definitely worth it. So next in our step-by-step guide is to provide visuals. And I'm going to hand it over to Twain here to talk a little bit about what types of visuals we're looking for and the importance of sending us visuals and what we can use them for. Twain?
Absolutely. So visuals are a big part of explaining your science. I know when I was an undergrad, I loved making posters and I loved creating visuals for the work that I was doing. So if you can sort of illustrate your work, not necessarily in terms of bar graphs or data visuals, but something that is a little more, I guess, engaging. Think about like animations. I know for some of the computational areas at Kremble, they're able to animate, say, molecules or particles or certain drugs or things like that, and how it could interact with, say, a cell membrane. Alternatively, imaging visuals are really cool too. I know we can live record from certain microscopes if you're in sort of a wet lab as well. So that could be really cool. You can show the types of cells that you're working on. Alternatively, even just visuals of you working in the lab is really cool. You know, you can take them with your cell phone or anything like that. They don't have to be fancy, but what it allows us to do is allows us to sort of pair the research with something that the audience can sort of relate to or understand, rather than having someone just do a talking head or things like that. You can also use infographics as well, and if you haven't checked out the Crumble Coffee Break on infographics, it's on our YouTube, so that can definitely help us explain your work as well in terms of the findings, how you got to answering your questions and things like that. So photos, animations, simple video can be done with your cell phone, doesn't have to be fancy, or infographics are all useful tools that can help tell the story of your research.
Absolutely. And think as creatively as possible. I mean, sometimes you might think, well, what am I supposed to provide visual wise? Twain just gave a couple of great suggestions. But think about, creatively what you might be able to provide to us. And again, you don't need fancy equipment. It's stuff you can do on your phone. Maybe you incorporate trainees or some of the students to, try to come up with some ideas too. So just great ideas and great ways to think ahead about visuals, because without visuals, there's really not much we can do. I'll just be very honest. No matter whether it's a print story or a potential television story or some sort of a video element that we can put together, visuals are helpful 100% of the time. So next in the step-by-step guide is to really think about, the audience that you're trying to reach. And how do you want us to help you reach them? So, I suggest making a list of stakeholders that include funders and organizations that you want to know about this new paper that's come out. And there's a couple of examples of on the right of organizations and different people that we generally reach out to. I'm going to throw it over to Sarah, who has been helping us a lot with the stakeholders for our podcast, Your Complex Brain, to talk about who she reaches out to and how effective that strategy is. Sarah?
Thank you, Heather. As Heather said, it is very important that you know your audience. You need to know who you're targeting, who your paper is going to affect. A stakeholder in this case is basically a party that has an interest in the research and can either affect or be affected by your study. Some examples of stakeholders would be nonprofit organizations who share a similar field of study, universities, and patient advocacy groups who are interested in the topic as well. We're going to use Alzheimer as an example. That's our first episode of our podcast. Some organization you might consider reaching out to would be Alzheimer's Society of Canada, Alzheimer Disease International, Alzheimer Dementia Australia, etc. This can be both domestic and international organization depending on your specific needs and the interest of your topic.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you. And again, as Sarah mentioned, there's organizations, there's also your collaborators too on the paper. So, I mean, oftentimes these are international collaborators. You maybe are not on Twitter, but maybe they are. And so if we're going to put together a social post, it would be great to know in advance what some of those Twitter handles are so that we can just be really strategic when we do reach out. And of course, there's the journal itself, and a lot of these journals have a very big following on social media. So again, just think ahead about who it is that you want to reach. It may be a very scientific paper and you want to keep it in the scientific community, and that's fine. So just think about the different organizations and just provide us with that list, and it's always helpful. Thanks, Sarah. So what is the best promotional strategy? As I mentioned, promotion is not always the best strategy. So sometimes you want to, it's something that you want your immediate scientific community to know about. And other times it's a story that, may be something that might be promoted further. So how do we determine this? And this is sort of like the $1 million question that we always get asked. So number one, if somebody sends us a paper and a plain language summary, and it sounds really interesting, it's always something that I would run by our UHN research colleagues first, because, if it's something that might go into a Crumble newsletter, or it's something that might be more of interest to the scientific community than the, main community, then our UHN research colleagues will often opt to write a story or again include it in a newsletter or in some other way on their side. So that's number one, is we touch base with our colleagues to determine the best strategy. If it's something that has, if it's a world first, if it's something that has immediate patient impact, if it's something that really is super unique and there are a lot of elements that might be of interest to a wider community or to the media, then we would consider a press release. So a press release is something that people often, if not always, request. In truth, it's not always the best strategy. So there's a lot that goes into sort of figuring out and deciding whether, it's worth writing a press release for any particular story. And, we also need to get sign off from some of our senior leadership about press releases. So it's not always up to us, just so that you know. But those are some of the parameters that we think about, whether or not something is we should be putting together a press release for it or not. Along the same lines, a media pitch. Oftentimes people will request us to reach out to media. And we do that a lot. I mean, we find the most success for media pitches, number one, when there's a patient element, even if it's a research story, if there's a patient that's involved in a research study that's agreed to be interviewed, even if it's a patient who has the disorder, someone that the media is able to feature. So if there's a patient element, we find not always, but much more success. And then the other thing with media is visuals. So, again, whether it's radio, whether it's print, whether it's television, the visuals always help, because even if it's a print story or radio story, they want photos to go on a website. If it's a television story, obviously they're going to want a patient story and they're going to want something that they can follow in terms of process. But it's not always worth pitching media, and we usually have a pretty good idea of what's something that might hit and something that really is not something that media would pick up on. And then, of course, we have the option of a UHN news story. UHN News runs very much like a newsroom. So we have an editor, and we pitch to the editor and, tell him what we're working on. And, that's always a great option if it's a really unique research study that maybe isn't something we would necessarily write a press release for, but it's interesting and appeals to the UHN community. So we could write a UHN news story. And then, of course, social media is a great way to get the word out about your research and your work. And one really effective way of doing that is to create something called a Twitter thread. And we're so lucky to have Scott Rich with us today. Scott works with us with Dr. Skinner and Dr. Valiente. And he recently had a really exciting paper come out for which he put together this amazing Twitter thread that he's going to tell us about right now. Scott?
Yeah, so it's sort of funny that I'm here right now, considering for my Twitter use, considering Heather had to drag me kicking and screaming on Twitter about 3 years ago now. But yeah, this sort of summary thread of our paper actually got a lot of interactions and in views and whatnot on Twitter, and helped spread the word about this paper somewhat organically, which is one of the nice things about social media. And I think sort of the couple of things that made this work were one, the sort of that first initial tweet, which Heather has on the left-hand side, is sort of a challenge because of there's the word limits on the character limits on Twitter. And you sort of had to do two things. You had to say, hey, here's a paper, here's who worked on it, the sort of the background. But then we had the challenge of, can we come up with a sort of pithy one sentence summary of what the paper was about to draw people in. And that's that, can lost neural heterogeneity be pathological, is something that, is very succinct and to the point and is digestible enough that, people across the scientific spectrum can understand that. And then, the remainder of the thread, we were able to get a little bit more into the details of the paper. And basically what it ended up being was, almost a Cliff Note summary of the paper, where I went through sort of figure by figure. This was a relatively short paper. There was only 5 figures, so we could do that, and basically took people through the story of the paper, pointing to each of the associated figures, which, I sort of, threw in as uploads onto the Twitter thread. So what was nice about this is people were able to get a very quick digested view of what the paper was about, just from these 7 or so tweets. and then go into the paper and click the link to get more details if they wanted it. And yeah, like I said, this was sort of, a lot of the stuff that Heather talked about in terms of how you write a summary for a general audience went into this as well, where, I tried to avoid jargon as much as possible, which is, more easier said than done, but try to make this as digestible as possible to a wide range of people who would, be reading this on Twitter. And, part of the success of this is that it sort of got the ideas from this paper got picked up a little bit in a broader audience, and these some of the people were looking at this and saying, hey, this is a neuroscience paper, but some of them the math and the theory has broader implications for the benefits of diversity in other sort of systems, or the benefits of diversity more philosophically, ethically, morally. So that was a really cool, almost unexpected side effect of this, of making this as digestible as possible to as many people as possible, allowed it to develop, very organically.
Thank you, Scott. And I just wanted to ask you too, I mean, you mentioned that your little Twitter journey for the last 3 years. What are some of the benefits that you've realized of being on Twitter, as someone in academia, in research? What is that like, that community, in terms of supportiveness and that type of thing when it comes to promoting your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be, academic Twitter has all the benefits and all the flaws of Twitter in general, right? It's social media. There's going to be, some weirdness in social media stats and whatnot that you sort of have to put to the side. But once you sort of get adjusted to that and do that, what's really nice is once you sort of find your community and the people that you follow and whatnot, Twitter becomes a really nice, summary of what's going on, whether it's other people promoting their own papers, whether it's, job postings. I found job postings and things like that much more easily through Twitter than I sometimes do on, the go-to job boards and things like that. And then, yeah, I think the other thing is it's a great networking tool. It's a great way to get your name out there and to, I've had some times where I've had back and forths, from people asking questions about my work and about my papers on Twitter, and have made connections that way. I think, there are people who I met at conferences who are like, oh yeah, I saw your such and such on Twitter, which again, all this is hilarious for me to say, considering I was so opposed to Twitter for some years ago. But yeah, I think that all of that, is a huge benefit, and it's something where you can control the narrative yourself. Like as what you've been talking about during this whole thing, what gets picked up in the media and what gets, is important to UHN news is something that's out of your control sometimes, but how you spin and advertise your own work on social media and who reads that is something that's very much in your own control, and you can control the narrative almost, which is something that, is a benefit of social media that we might not have, been able to do 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, agreed. And the only thing I would add to that is that, it's not so easy to get media pickup on different stories these days. Even if it's an amazing story, it really kind of depends what else is happening in the world. So something like this, a really well thought out tweet thread. I mean, Scott, you worked on this for, weeks in advance to perfect it so it was ready when the paper actually came out. It really lets you set the narrative, and it's also something that lives on. So if somebody ever wants to go back and sort of learn more about the paper, they've got that tweet thread. So that's another reason why I really like it. So thank you very much for weighing in.
Thanks.
So a couple quick things to keep in mind based on what we've talked about. Most people know this, but just a reminder to never break an embargo set by a publication. So they're going to give you an embargo date if there's a paper to be coming out. Oftentimes, we may provide something in advance to media under embargo, people that we've worked with and people that we trust. But as a researcher, as a scientist, you should never break an embargo and put any information about your paper out before the publication date. Please don't contact media directly. This does happen a lot, and it just makes it a little bit more challenging for us to do our jobs. We have relationships with a lot of the people that we work with in the media, and so it's much better for us to be able to contact them with all of the information, with the plain language summary, with all of the visuals, than just somebody reaching out on their own and then having to backtrack and sort of figure out what we can set up. So it's just much more ideal for you to go through public affairs than trying to contact the media directly. And number 3, think twice before setting up social media account for the purposes of publicizing one paper. So as I think you can tell, I mean, we're pretty big proponents of social media to promote your work, but as Scott can attest, it's a lot of work. So, you know, if you're going to set up a Twitter, if you're thinking about social media, there's a whole other coffee break session that you can watch to get a few tips about that. But it is a lot of work. It's something to think about in advance in terms of being strategic about that. But if you're just trying to promote one paper, we're very happy to do it through the Crumble handles. And it's not something that you need to set up a separate Twitter account just to promote that one paper. I do get asked about that from time to time, so that's why I thought I would just mention it. So to recap, please tell us about your paper once it's been accepted and keep us posted on the timelines and the embargo dates. And sometimes there's hiccups along the way and revisions and things like that. So just best to let us know what's happening with that paper in terms of a timeline. Feel free to connect us with your contact at the journal too, but oftentimes it's just easiest, you know, to keep it easy and just to keep us updated on some of this information. We will collaborate with you on the best strategy. So as I mentioned, it's, you know, the best strategy isn't always to pitch everything to media if we're pretty confident that it's not something they may be interested in. The best strategy might be to go through UHN research and see whether it's something that they can write a story about. So like, it's really important to have that discussion with us and really to think about, you know, for this paper in particular, keeping those 3 things in mind in terms of patient impact and uniqueness of the study. You know, what is the best strategy to get it out there? Put together a plain language summary of your paper. Always, always, always. It will always come in handy, whether for you or for us, to help you promote the paper. And finally, just again, consider the audience that you want to reach. Maybe it is just the scientific audience, depending on the paper. Maybe you really want to get the word out to potential patients or to people in the community who can support your work. Maybe it's donors. So think about who you want to reach. And then when we have that discussion about collaborating on the best strategy, it helps us decide, you know, whether it's social media or whether it's UHN news or the best way forward. So that is the end of our quick little Crumble Coffee Break mini series recap today on how to help you promote your work. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we've got some time for questions if we've got questions.
So if you have any questions, we are a small group today. Feel free to just unmute yourself and just chime in and ask your question or comment and contribute. Or if your microphone is not working or you prefer not to, feel free to type into the chat as well. Heather had Twain had mentioned some resources on the Crumble YouTube page. There you will find a whole bunch of videos featuring some of you or your colleagues, as well as the past coffee break series from the past 2 summers. I think Heather also alluded to some of those sessions, so feel free to go check them out. Also, there was mention of the Crumble podcast. We've just released our 10th and final episode for season 1. If you haven't had a chance yet, I've also thrown a link to the podcast series. Feel free to have a listen. It's very interesting. I'm not biased.
Me too.
I'm going to kickstart the questions because I always have a lot of questions. One of the things you said off the top, Heather, is that we should let you know as soon as a paper is accepted.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all of our labs are so productive. So many papers get accepted all of the time. Do they contact you for every single paper? Should they?
Excellent point, Amy. Excellent point. Really, no. I mean, if it's, I think you have intuition as to whether a paper is something that, you know, might be of interest to a wider audience. You know, sometimes it's something that's a stepping stone along the way to some research. Maybe it's, you know, sometimes impact factor does weigh in, but not always. So that's something to consider if it's in a journal with a higher impact factor. But I think it's really, I mean, if you're not sure, absolutely send it to us. I mean, I think we're a really good gauge of whether it's something we can help with or not. But be prepared that, you know, it really has to be, it has to answer those 3 questions for public affairs to really get involved, in terms of the uniqueness of the study, in terms of the, potential for patient impact and that type of thing. But if we can't help you directly, we can help advise you on how to promote the paper on your own. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, Amy, but it's a good one. You're right. We would be just overwhelmed with papers 100% of the time. And you have to think if it's worth your time too, to write a plain language summary, because again, it's time consuming. So if it's something that's important to you, if it's something you've been working on that you're proud of, that you think has impact, then take the time, write the plain language summary, and we'll work with you on the best way to help promote your work.
Okay, that's good to know. Does anybody else have a question?
I have a question for Scott. Because, it's interesting. Scott and I have this discussion a lot because, to Scott's credit, he does some really incredibly interesting work and he wants people to know about it. And he's had this Twitter journey. So now he's had, it's opened up his world to know, some promotion for his work in the past. So Scott, what is it like for you from a researcher's perspective when you've got a new paper out like this one that came out in Cell Reports and you're very excited about it and you want to promote it? And we did have that conversation about how best to promote it. And we did decide on this Twitter thread. I mean, what is that like from your perspective? We're talking from the public affairs perspective, but, are you satisfied with that? What's going through your mind when you're thinking about how to promote it on your end?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as a researcher, we're all a little bit narcissistic in the sense that we all think every paper that we've made is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Which is why we have people like you to tell us, rightfully so, like, yeah, no, this isn't gonna, make it on a CP24 necessarily or something like that. But I think that the biggest factor is this going to be interesting to the wider public, and or is there a way to spin this so that it's going to be interesting to the wider public? And that's something that is, for the average researchers, it's sometimes harder to recognize and see, as opposed to the skills that you all and your team have. That was something that, working with you and talking through the paper, was part of why I think this thing was so successful, is we basically realized, okay, this is the sort of the point we want to hammer home. We don't want to tell anyone about the math and that stuff because that's just going to scare people away. But we focus on how this influences epilepsy patients, right? Here's this new perspective on epilepsy as a disease, and that's something that people can look at and say, okay, that's interesting. I know such and such person with epilepsy who is struggling and isn't being treated in a way that we're happy with. Maybe this is something that helps them down the line. And I that was something that was a skill that I think, because we always chat a bunch, I think I picked up that skill of how to twist that and find that nugget by through our conversations, through just being on Twitter and seeing what gets popular and what doesn't. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I think that one of the things that I like about Twitter is that you can sort of control whether or not you want to go in that direction. There's a very viable argument to be made that for certain types of work, it's not meant for a larger audience. It's not necessarily meant for general consumption, but it's more important that, the people who are in your niche, who are in your field, are exposed to it. And that's a completely different, strategy than, going to public affairs and, making a news release go out, right? And so I think that's something that, again, being on Twitter, you can control that. You can figure out how to do that, and sort of, make your own destiny in that way. Once you and part of that too is, like, I think it was really important that I liked how you said, don't make a Twitter account just for one paper. For better or worse, Twitter followers are essentially a currency. And, it's one of these sort of silly things that everything in our world is gamified right now. And it's the same thing with Twitter followers. But If you
Mhm.
have a Twitter account for, 3-4 years and you chat with people and you answer a question the PhD student puts on Twitter, and you gain, a few hundred followers that way, you're much more likely to have something get to the right people and spread, as opposed to if you just make an account, the
Yeah.
day before your paper comes out. And again, that's something that I have to give you credit for. You sort of dragged me kicking and screaming into this world, and then it ended up being a very successful part of my research program that I have that platform now. And by platform, I should clarify, like I have 1,000 followers. It's not a lot, but it's like
That's pretty good.
it's decent for a postdoc. It's good. Like, people sometimes people call me the Twitter guy at conferences, and the drives me crazy. Like, no, I'm not that good. Anyway.
I've heard that the 1,000 follower threshold is really where things start to open up. So you'll have to keep us posted about that. Once you hit 1,000, apparently
Yeah,
it's
maybe there's some exponential growth coming in.
maybe. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks for weighing in, Scott. And again, the title of the webinar today is Help Us Help You Promote Your Work. And I think it's as simple as that. So these are just some quick tips that we've come up with to help us help you promote your work. I don't think we have any other questions, Amy. Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thanks to everybody who joined us today and everybody who's watching the recording. And as always, you can feel free to reach out to your public affairs team, and we're happy to advise and help you promote your work. So thanks so much and have a great day.